All right, I guess that's a good moment to start. How's the day going so far? The conference good this year? Good. The way I envision that session is something maybe like the state of Decoupled Drupal, if you will. Can you check that out? Oh, it's on. Wow, it's not working. Don't know what's happening.
It's in presentation mode, right?
Yeah. It is. Well,
Okay.
Hi, I'm Simon. I'm the director of technology for Evolving Web, a nice Canadian company that you learned about this morning, for those who don't know. And as a matter of fact, I would like to thank everyone once again for the warm feedback that we got this morning and throughout the day. That's really really helps compensating what we're leaving on the other side of the border from what we get. I've been in the Drupal field for more than 15 years, and the first good portion, more than a decade, almost entirely building Decoupled Drupal project. So if you start to do the math, yes, I did my first Decoupled Drupal project with Drupal 6. So it's been a long way, and now I'm spending less time with the code and more time overseeing projects. I'm in a better position to kind of compare Decoupled project versus more typical projects and kind of give my feedback on that, give my views on that. So I'm going to do a quick presentation, a quick explanation of what it is. We're gonna see an example of how it's actually built, and then we'll think of what's coming next, basically. Before we start, a quick word for today's sponsor, Evolving Web. So we're a digital agency located in Montreal. We a crew of 8 people, including baby Sophia. We drove down to Princeton to be with you guys. That's really one of our best community events of the year. We're there almost every year. As you probably know, we're working for our head. We're working for healthcare, governments, public organizations. We deliver the full range of the agency services, strategy, design, building website and web apps. And we also have a training offering. So if you need training on Drupal development, training on content editing, and also custom training for your team needs, you can talk to us. So that presentation is meant to be fairly non-technical, so everything should be fairly high level. There's a couple of slides that dive a little bit more in the topic because I know that some people want to see some code, and there are more crazier topics, but I've put some indicators, so if you see those icons and you don't understand, that's probably fine. You can just wait for the next slide. So let's look a little bit at the landscape. What's decoupled, basically? But decoupled or headless, or we've been back and forth between the two terms, and I don't know which word you prefer, but I'm gonna try to define those words first. So, what is decoupled? So decoupled refers more to the overall architecture, if you will. It's more like the difference between building with one single component or multiple components. Think about distributed systems or service-oriented architectures, that kind of things. So decoupling Drupal doesn't really mean that we're not going to see Drupal and Drupal is not going to be the website. That means that some of the stuff that Drupal's sometimes doing or oftentimes doing is decoupled and done by a different component. So that could be, for example, doing e-commerce or doing form submission management and that kind of things with a different component in a complex architecture. Headless, on the other side, refers more to the distinction between front-end and back-end. So on the monolith approach, if you will, Drupal does it all. And when we're speaking about headless, we're referring to Drupal as a backend being used without a front end that for some reason we refer as the head. So basically we're going to talk about decoupled solutions that are built with headless CMS. So how does that work? So if we go back to the basics, with a typical Drupal setup, when you interact with the website, your browser is going to request a web page from the server is going to deliver the web page, the browser is going to render the web page, and that's the end of the story until a link's clicked, and then we do it all over again, which means we, once again, download a full web page that we render, and so on and so forth. In a decoupled or headless situation, we're not going to load web pages, we're going to load one application, let's say single page application, if you will, or an integrated application in a page. That application will stop and run inside the browser, and then the server is just not going to deliver pages, HTML pages, but just data that the decoupled front end is going to render on the screen. So basically, we take Drupal, what the good backend stuff is capable of doing, and we take a different stack to handle all the front end aspects. And to connect the two, we need an API. Looks interesting, right? But is it worth it? So, as an anecdote, if you will, when I was working on decoupled architecture or headless Drupal, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, first question, someone wants to take a guess at which front-end stack we were using back then. Anyone?
jQuery and JavaScript.
Not even that. It's even. I'm not even really proud of that. It's worse than that.
Yeah, what tools?
Adobe Flash.
Adobe Flash.
Well, but if you think about it, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we didn't have a video tag. We weren't able to play music or do awesome CSS-based animations and awesome UX and that kind of things. It was kind of the only way, so that's why we went for that architecture back then. Now, the web platform caught up and we're capable of doing all of that with like the open web, basically. But there's still sometimes reasons to be willing to do more advanced UX or to implement interactions, to want a website that's not constantly going to reload the pages, but that is going to be more refreshless, if you will. Also, using a headless approach, when you can basically ignore a little bit the backend and work more on your front end, you can achieve better performance. You can go back to the state of the web as we knew it before, which is basically a bunch of static content that is ready to be served, doesn't need necessarily to be constructed dynamically by the CMS every time it's requested. Another aspect is, if you have Drupal that's not managing the presentation aspect, you can use it for multiple channels. You can use it for multiple purposes. Something that might explain it, if you will. You can have a Drupal backend that manages a feed of news, and then you're going to use that to populate a website or an application, or even interactive and non-interactive screen in a venue, that kind of things. It's also going to allow you to reinforce your content governance, is basically see your content more as a semantic content rather than a bunch of unstructured blob of HTML. So it's on the long term, it's content that's more reusable. But also something that we might not think about at the beginning is leveraging what exists. So if you want to rebuild a website or build a website, but you have a team that only knows React or Vue.js, for example, you can still use Drupal as the CMS and keep the skill set you have to build the front end, and you'll be able to maintain it on the long run without having to relearn the whole Drupal front end stack. And at the same thing, if there's existing components, if you have an existing web stack, whatever it is, and you want to start using Drupal, because for content editors it's going to provide a better user experience, you can use it and then feed the existing components with that data and start using Drupal from the back, basically. And also, I also like to speak about the long-term backend investment, because when we're in that world of willing to use the latest and greatest front-end technologies and say, oh, I'm going to use React, and then the next day you want to use Vue.js, the next day you want to try something else, it's good to have something that that's there for the long term when it comes to the content, the data that you want to put in your front end, but then maybe recycle and redo your front end more often in an easier way, basically. Quick mention about what's called the PWA space, or progressive web applications. That's just a marketing term. It's just an umbrella term to regroup a set of features that the web platforms or the browsers basically are exposing to developers to provide additional features. For example, like being able to send notification, or being able to persist content locally on the device and have an offline experience for a website. One of the new features interesting, for example, the barcode detection. That's interesting. Like you can build web pages that are able to use the camera of the phone to scan like barcodes or QR codes without relying on a third-party library. Those features are usually easier to use in a modern front-end stack, such as React or Vue.js or Angular or you name it. But that doesn't mean you cannot use those features with a typical Drupal. I want to mention it because in the decision process, it's not because you want a PWA that you need to move away from Drupal. That's for sure. For example, offering an offline experience on a website, so having a website or portion of a website that is going to be available offline if you ever already visited once, you can do that with Drupal alone, with the module is, I think, called PWA. I have to check on that. So, we've heard what it is in general. We've seen some of the upsides. How do we actually start building a decoupled architecture? Of course, like a chunk of it is similar to a traditional website. We're gonna have to structure content, but then we need to look at like the subtleties that is going to make that a little bit different. We're gonna have to connect that backend, that headless backend, to the front end we're gonna build with another technology. Of course, building the application, but I'm not meaning actually coding it. It's like once it's coded and it works on the developer machine, how do you actually release it and publish it? How do you deploy it? Because it's not Drupal, so it has to be deployed and hosted somewhere. So for the content architecture, well, first, you're going to have definitively to think more semantically about the meaning of your content rather than visually, in terms of visual components that are just designed in a specific visual way. Because your backend really manipulates data, and you're not going really to have a WYSIWYG experience on the content editor side. It's really going to be more fields in entities that have a specific meanings. You manipulate, I don't know, product, pieces of news, and that kind of things. You can still have an idea of components, like visual components, to do some page building, but those are not going to be visual. It's more like, okay, the content editor knows they're going to have, for example, a hero, but they're not necessarily going to have an idea of how it looks like. Might seem weird, but if you think about it, it's actually easier than to repurpose the same content on multiple different channels and having a specific component implementation for that channel. For example, desktop versus mobile, but also versus a native application, or repurposing the content on a completely different context on a completely different website. So that means that usually in the Drupal world, we go with paragraphs. That's the one that makes the most sense. But layout builder is still possible if you want to expose an idea of the layout of the page to the content editor. But once again, it's not going to be what you see is what you get. It's really more what you see is what you mean. And implementing the front end is going to be a little bit more complex because on top of implementing the components, you're going to have to implement those dynamic layouts too. And then now that we have defined our content, we need to expose it because the Drupal doesn't manage the front end, so it needs to be exposed to the outside for front end, so that the front end can consume it and display it. There's two major options in the Drupal world. There are JSON API and GraphQL. Frankly speaking, in terms of features, they're offering both the same feature set. They're both allow discovering the content, fetching it, retrieving it when it's complex. For example, if you have one piece of content, logically speaking, that's a composition of, I don't know, 15 nodes and 42 taxonomy terms and images and media. Both are going to allow you to fetch all of that in one swoop and as a single unit of data. And they're both capable of invoking custom business logic if needs be. They can be complementary. It's totally possible to enable both and use the one that's the best tool for the job on specific situation. I think JSON API is more like the standard REST-based, JSON-based API that we know. That's more like rigid, and GraphQL is more like a language and like it's more like a developer tool. It's like you can express the query to extract your data within the front end directly. So both have a use case for sure. The thing that might be a deal breaker in some organization is just the fact that JSON API is part of core for a long time already, which means in terms of managing less dependencies to your code and having less security updates and patching, that kind of things, one might prefer just to go for JSON API, just for reducing the complexity of maintaining the code base on the long run. So now we know how to expose the content on the outside. We're going to build a front-end app. But what is it going to look like in terms of deployment? How are we going to put that front-end application to the world? There's two families of front-end application when it comes to dealing with a headless CMS, Drupal in particular. The first that I like to call the single-page application is just, instead of delivering a page, you're just going to boot up a JavaScript-based application in the browser, and it's going to be completely dynamic. Every time something happens, the app is going to fetch data from Drupal and render the stuff on the screen. Which means if Drupal's not there, it doesn't work. Since there's a dependency at runtime to the availability of the backend. And it also means that it's not like it comes with some challenge when it comes with some challenge with respect to, for example, SEO, like how Google is going to index a web page that's just basically all the pages are just an app. All the pages just serve the same HTML markup that boots up the app. And in that case, that means you're going to need to, on the side, have specific tools that are going to detect that the traffic is coming from Google, and you're going to have to pre-render the app. It's a little bit more complex, but that's just the origin. That's the way it started, basically. And then the second model that I refer to as the static site generation, SSG. Basically, everything, or the most part, gets pre-rendered. At build time, all the content that exists in the CMS is identified. All the content gets extracted as it would be in a dynamic fashion, but then everything is done during the build phase. Put up with the code, and then everything is deployed as a single unit. And then at runtime, it's not dependent on the backend anymore, except for very dynamic features like submitting a form or buying a product. So now we have the good mental model of what we're going to build. Let's talk about the different options that we can use on the front end. I mean, there's always new frameworks that appear, come and go, and you might want to try. But since a couple of years, I mean, it really settles, and the three main options that we have in the field are Next.js, that's basically based on React. Next.js, it's a clever name, right? They thought about it for a long time, right? Next.js based on Vue, hence the Next.js, and Angular. The way I like to see those is the first two are way more designed for web, building websites, and where Angular shines is really more on the application field, like enterprise application, mobile application, that kind of things. It's a little bit more complex, in my opinion, to manage the typical website flows and navigation and stuff like that, and with Angular. I guess personal preferences, but not entirely. I'm going to have a little spiel about why I think Next.js, so based on React, is the way to go today. First, there's the general bigger popularity of React over the two others, which means in terms of documentation and access to the community that can support you, and plugins and long-term investments. I guess that's there's a plus, there's an edge here. Next.js comes with a backend layer. Next.js 2, in a way, Angular. It depends. I mean, it's coming, but it's almost always in the form of plugins. So Next.js as a backend layer, but the most important thing is like it has the greatest integration with Drupal currently. There has been a massive work done by our friends and colleagues at the Chapter 3 agency that's been building relentlessly the next Drupal project that basically provide all the a config module that you install on the Drupal side, and some kind of glue code or scaffolding code on the Next.js side that makes really the building of the solution. It simplified that a lot, and it gives a good place to start and a good methodology to build the application. I'm going to show you some examples, just like to see what it looks like. So that's a website we built a couple of years ago for Princeton International. So we're there. The reason to use a decoupled front, and so what you see here is a React app basically with a Drupal on the back, just because there was a need for there's a complex UX in terms of interactivity. It's a long process where you have to do the same operation multiple times and fill some fields, and the value you can use depends on what you've been filling out in previous steps. So building that as a typical set of Drupal pages was a little bit was considered a little bit too complex. It also saves the progression as you go, so it's also way easier to do that with a kind of stateful application that lives on the page. But when you see it, like you don't really know, because it's a React app embedded on the page. You don't really know where the React app starts and when the Drupal page ends and when the React app starts. It's there. Second example is just more a typical website we built for Englobe Corp. It's let's say environmental projects management company, if you will. It looks like a typical website. If you go to URL, share the slides obviously, you'll see that there's like more impressive animations that are using masks and things that scale up and that really needs the page to not reload every time you click on a link. And that's why the front-end team decided to go this time with Vue.js. But they were still really, it was a hard requirement to have a CMS to manage the content, and Drupal was selected. And the third and last example is the more recent work we did for Planned Parenthood. I think it's also a good time to mention them. There might also be some kind of trouble in the recent times. We helped them build a website that promotes the Planned Parenthood direct service that they launched 1 year and a half ago. And in that case, the reasoning is that they were really clear they wanted a CMS, and they already pre-selected Drupal in terms of what they wanted to use. It was a good fit for the content entry people, but their team internally was only knowledgeable about React. So they were like, do we learn Twig and the whole conundrum of the Drupal front-end stack, or do we go headless? And in the end, we decided to go headless. Another aspect is like they had really strong requirements in terms of performance and security. And by going headless, all the front end is basically a static artifact that's generated every time the content's updated in Drupal and lives as a single entity. Drupal can basically be turned off once the website is deployed. So in terms of security, we reduce the surface of attack, and there's no dynamic aspect on the server, so it's blazing fast. So let's look at how that particular project was implemented. I'm going to give you a little bit of more technical details about how we build it, basically. So that's our shopping list of stuff we need to identify, build, or buy, or find. When we look at that list, it seems like a lot, but actually, if you think about it, most of it's already handled for free by Drupal. We only need to focus on presentation aspects. Implementing a content model, I mean, Drupal does that for a long time. Providing an administrative UI, that's what it's good at. Supporting moderation workflows, supporting content translation. There's modules for that. It's more often than not part of the Drupal core. So let's dive into it. So once the content architecture has been thought of during the discovery phase, we can just start implementing our content types as if it was a standard, typical Drupal project. Then Drupal is going to handle all the configuration management and deployment. That's just the export of the Drupal configuration. We don't need to dive into details, just like it's handled for us. There's no need to code anything. And on the React side, the same way we would develop like Twig-based template using Twig, we're just going to develop React components. So if you're a React developer, you understand that. You know that those are just different components. If you're not a React developer, that's fine. You just need to know that your front-end team is going to be comfortable building that. That's what React is good at. So for each content type, we just create a React component that's basically the template of that content type. On that website, we use Paragraph to kind of model all the different components of a page. And it's basically the same thing. We define the paragraphs like we do for a typical website. Drupal's handling all the content architecture side of things. And for each paragraph, we're going to provide a React component. So we have our building blocks. We have a way to define the template of a page. We have a way to define the template of each component on that page. Now, there's a little bit of a challenge with the path. When you think about it, you're going to ask a React app to display a page that's identified by a specific URL. But the React app doesn't really know what to do with that because it's an alias. Most of the cases, it's something that the content editor decides what URL to associate to each piece of content. That means the React app needs to resolve, kind of ask Drupal, hey, what's behind that URL, what it is? And then Drupal's going to do what it does. It's going to identify that's an alias for, in that case, the node /43. And it's going to instruct the front end about characteristic of that page so that the front end can call the Drupal and load the data associated to that node. And once it fetches it, it can render it, and we're gonna see how in a minute. The under the hood, that basically means that the React app is going to call a specific API, like the translate path API we see in the top left, passing the path, and then in return it's gonna get the full details about what is behind that path. In that case, in the entity section, Drupal is going to say, look, that's just a node. Its type, so its bundle is a page. It has that ID, and it has that UUID. Yeah. Drupal, we like to have IDs and UUIDs for things, and in the JSON API world, for the JSON API implementation for Drupal, we use the UUIDs to target the data. But that's also going to be transmitted to the app in the JSON API section, which means the front end, the React app, just needs to take that URL, invoke it, and going to get the details about the node needs to display. Which means if we take a sample page for the content editor, to just do what they're used to in typical Drupal setup, they create in that case, a hero. They put the component to display all the articles. And in that example, the page was composed also with a become a tester, call to action, and a newsletter form. React app know what component to display for for all the different types of data that comes to Drupal. That's simply a map. We're going to just associate all the different type of content on the Drupal side to a specific component on the React side. And we could associate the same template to different types of entities on the Drupal side if we want to, if we need to. And it is just a loop. It might look complex for someone that's not used to JavaScript development or React coding, but what we see on the screen here is just a template for a node of type page, so static page. And the important bit is the map instruction. That's basically just a fancy JavaScript way of looping over all the paragraphs of the page, and for each one creating the component that's appropriate for that specific paragraph. Next, one important aspect is the management of menus. It's not because we're decoupling the front end that we're going to hard code the navigation menu inside the app. And if the site owner wants to change the order of the menu or add a new item or whatever, they're going to need to they need to open a feature request to their front-end team. No, we want to keep using the Drupal capabilities of defining the menu, translating the menu, setting a label that might potentially be different from the node it's targeting, and retrieve that data and display it on the front end. Not going to go into much details, but just know that there's a country project for that basically extend JSON API to provide all the information required for the front end to discover the menus and display them on the front end. And then I mentioned it, the content edition process is not a WYSIWYG experience. It's we saw some example of the UI of paragraphs a few slides ago. What we have instead is the ability to preview by invoking the front end inside the Drupal administrative UI experience. That's a feature that's provided by the Drupal Next module, the integration module, that basically replaces the view, let's say, tab of each node. You stay in the admin UI, and then you have your front-end application that's started at the right place for that specific page, so the content editor can preview the changes before publishing. It supports revision, so here in that case, it's going to display the latest revision, even if it's not the published one. So it seems like we have almost everything. We just need to publish that to production, basically. In the current state of affairs, it has become very, very simple. The Next framework, so Next.js, that is built on top of React, provides all the build chain with a single command that handles all the details of interacting with Drupal, fetching the list of all the pages that exist in Drupal, fetching all the JSON data, all the JSON API data that correspond to all those nodes, put that with the code base of the front end, so that we have a nice artifact we can publish on a hosting provider, like a Netlify or any kind of static site hosting provider. So that usually we manage that with a kind of a CI/CD pipeline, so that every time the code base is modified, the front end can be rebuilt. There are some renewed Drupal hosting companies that also happen to be last-minute sponsors of the conference, so we can mention them, and offers an actual support for those decoupled front-end architecture, and provide a way to handle the build phase. So you don't need to maintain a CI/CD environment. What we need is a way for a non-developer, a non-technical person, so a content editor, to rebuild, to trigger the rebuild of the front end, because every time the content is going to be updated in the CMS, we're going to have to rebuild and redeploy the application. And that's the job of a module called deploy hooks, which basically provide a button the content editor can click to trigger the rebuild and deploy of the application. The UI looks like that, so the module tracks all the nodes that were changed created since the last deployment, so that the person responsible of deploying can get at a glance everything that changed. They can open each of those in preview mode, check that everything's okay, before triggering the rebuild of the application. So, in a nutshell, if we focus on the Drupal side of things, so the headless Drupal, we have a dependency on a few Drupal contribs to be able to get going. I mentioned a few of them. There's others here that are usually required. But what about the custom code, right? It's a complex architecture. What's the, but someone want to take a guess of how many custom modules we had to build for that project? Between 1 to 10.
0.
0. There's not a single line of custom code on the Drupal side on a project like that, which, in my opinion, is amazing, given how complex it was to develop Decoupled Drupal project 5 to 10 years ago. Here's a reference to the next Drupal project that I've been mentioning. They have pretty good documentation to get started. But there's a catch, there's a secret. But it's a secret that I only tell to my Drupal favorite people. But don't worry, if you're in that room, you're definitively part of my Drupal favorite people, so I'm going to tell you the secret. It's the headless equation. And the headless equation states that a project equals 2 projects. And that's something that you should remind, even if it looks simple, and it has actually become simple, it still remains 2 projects. You're going to have a Drupal project, you're going to have a React project, you're going to get 2 Git repository, potentially 2 different teams, or at least maybe 2 people to manage when for some project it could be handled by a single resource. Which means if it's your first take, maybe don't start with a low budget project or something that really needs to be built in a couple of weeks, because that might be challenging. And the other secret, which I just disclosed, but then you can take that and tell everyone as a secret, we don't need custom code on a build like that. So that means we can refer to Drupal as a headless CMS. A no-code headless CMS, like there are a lot out there.
It's time for questions.
Sorry?
It's all time for questions.
No, there will be no question. There will be no question. What I just want to say is, like, if I'm going to wrap up quickly, but I'm nearing the end. Nowadays, if someone that's not in the Drupal world is going to go and look at the market, the offering in terms of headless CMS options, it's very likely that they're going to stumble upon Drupal. I encourage you to do it. Google 2025 top 5 headless CMS. Drupal's not going to be on the list, and I think that's something we can change. Here on the right, you have all the steps that the Drupal Next project document to get going. It's not about React until here. And all of that is just about Drupal. In my opinion, it's too complex. We have a no-code headless CMS that can only be built by Drupal coders. And it's a little bit sad. So I think we need to make Drupal easier to discover as a headless CMS offering. So it's probably some kind of a marketing aspect, like we did with Drupal CMS, basically. And we also need to be able to get going more quickly. It needs to be easier to quick start, basically. And what I have in mind, it's a bold take, and I'm interested to see how you're going to react to the next slide. I think we need a recipe or some kind of integration with Drupal CMS that makes it as easy as Drupal CMS to get a headless CMS with sound defaults so that Drupal can be more evaluated, being in the space and being considered as a headless CMS. And we can start eating some of the market shares of the Contentful of the world, because I think we're definitively superior in terms of feature and long-term investment. Thank you very much. If there's any question, maybe we can allow one, and then I'm there for the rest of the day. We can chat, or you can react.
So just for clarification, you were talking about making the JSON API calls and things like that. So we do Vue.js on the front end. We're using JWT for authentication. We create those tokens for each user so we get proper access control, that kind of stuff. How are you guys doing your user authentication when you're making these RESTs?
Well, so that's a really good question. Obviously, when the whole static site generation aspect and extracting all the content really makes sense for unauthenticated web experience. If it's authenticated, it's like it becomes more of an app, and I think it's not really the same realm, if you will. So in that context, there's no particular authentication beside just the React, the Next.js build chain that has some kind of a token to avoid exposing the API to the world, but that's just a server-to-server authentication in that case. Yeah.
My question is like Decoupled is being in Drupal for a long time, like not short time, but it's still like a lot of people still either afraid or not really feel or feel like it's not necessary to use it. Do you have some sense of why? And also, do you have any example that it's not a good website should transfer to Decoupled?
It's an excellent question. I can't really speak to why people would be afraid to try it or to have interest on it. I don't think. I think that despite that being a really good solution for some use case, it's not a silver bullet. Like it's not a one size fits all. There's really there's use cases where it's really a good tool for the job, and I tend to say that there's a lot of use cases, even for a really big website, where a typical Drupal stack is really going to be enough and really a good tool for the job. I don't know, even we're in Princeton. If you take the typical university website, it's a lot of web pages, it's a lot of content, and there's not a lot of compelling reason for investing a lot more money because it's going to be a very big and very expensive project. Drupal does it already fine in the standard way. When it's interesting is like if you want to design and build a very compelling user experience, something that's very different from the typical page-to-page navigation, something that is heavily personalized, something that looks more like an application than a website, but in which you still want to have some flexibility over the content that you feed in the application, so you're not going to go and change the code, the source code every time you need to update it. Those are really good use cases. And as I said, if you have access to a dev team resources that are knowledgeable about Vue.js or React, then they'll be ready to go, ready to start implementing the front end. So that might be a good. It's a case-by-case decision.
I have another question. I'm sorry. Do you ever feel like when you use because we're thinking about transfer, but also we are kind of collecting all those examples and good and bad and try to balance like should we transfer? Do you feel like cache will be issue for like when you after your content rebuild and for the content people, for the UX people to see their change immediately? Where that cache going to be a thing?
Well, I think the easiest and lazy answer is like caching is always a problem anyway. Right? Now, more specifically, so first, the production website is statically generated in that example. The live preview isn't. The live preview for content editors works like the first case that I mentioned, is like it's fully dynamic. Mm-hmm. So it's always going to show what the API feeds, what comes straight from the Drupal database, if you will.
Yeah.
And then the caching issue that might arise are exactly the same than if you wouldn't go decoupled, which is like if, let's say, the cache tags or the cache context are not well defined, the JSON API, when it comes to the cache, works exactly the same way than Drupal. So if you don't have issue of caching with the typical Drupal, you won't have with a decoupled approach, and conversely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have you got the option when a node is updated to be deployed directly and not waiting for someone to trigger it?
Well, yeah, unfortunately it's 45 minutes. It's not a 2 hours master. There are options. It's called ISG, incremental ESR, sorry, incremental static regeneration, which basically augment the backend side of the front-end side, so that you can signal, the backend can signal to the backend side of the front-end that a specific piece of content was updated, and then the front-end can reveal only that, basically.
No, but you show the page where they can build the application from Drupal and show the node.
Right now you cannot,
you can hook into it, right? And then you can write your code and then
you can
like publish then.
You can definitively, but then you don't have that experience of like staging a bunch of content and deploying. It would be more in a context where the moment it gets published, it triggers the rebuild.
Yes.
Yeah, but totally, you hook to a node update hook and then you trigger the deploy. Okay. All right, thank you very much. I leave that here. If you've been in the room the whole day, it's the, 10th time we mention it, but we'll have organizing Evolved Drupal in Boston in June. So if you're interested, you can just come to this, and I guess I'm pretty sure you already heard about it. So I leave it there. Thanks.
Stop, please.